Here you see examples for comma rule 1, items in a series. We're going to use commas to separate 3 or more items written in a series. Now, if there are exactly 3, we separate with commas. If there are less than 3, that'd be 2. We're just going to use the word and between them. So I've given 2 examples for different types of series. The first sentence says, his characteristics were wisdom, strength, and humility. Now, if I'm speaking that out loud, I kind of naturally take a pause where the items are going to separate with a comma. But I also need to remember that when I'm looking at what I'm separating, it needs to be the same type of thing in the series or part of speech. And in this case, they're all going to be adjectives describing his characteristics. So, his characteristics were wisdom, comma, strength, comma, and humility. Notice that I'm going to use the comma in the places where I would have said the word and. His characteristics were wisdom and strength and humility. You might say, well, you already have the word and there before humility. That's true, I do. But you do use another comma before the actual word and. The second example says, we sailed down the river, along the coast, and into a little bay. Once again, if I'm speaking that out loud, I want to take a pause where those commas would go. But here I'm not separating single words, but I'm separating prepositional phrases. We sailed down the river, along the coast, and into a little bay. So we were down the river, along the coast, and into a little bay. Notice that you have your parts of speech here. Down the river, along the coast, into a little bay. So there's my parts of speech that are determining where I'm going to place those commas. Here's comma rule 2. Comma rule 2 is speaking specifically about separating adjectives that come before a noun. In the first sentence, I see John Milton wrote bright, vigorous poetry. And I'm going to put my comma right after the word bright before the word vigorous. I could substitute that word and in my sentence and it would make sense. John Milton wrote bright and vigorous poetry. If I used the and, I am not going to use the comma. So in this example, I've shown the and just to show you where that would go if I'm doing the test to see if it works. In the second example, it says, he was a brave, patriotic prince. Notice how we naturally take a pause where that comma is going to go between the adjectives brave and patriotic. And if I want to use that word and as my test, it would read, he was a brave and patriotic prince. And that makes sense if I say it that way. So there's comma rule 2. Comma rule 3 discusses compound sentences. If you have 2 complete thoughts and they are joined with a conjunction word, and, but, or, for, nor, yet, those are the most common, then those 2 thoughts have to be also joined with a comma. And you put a comma at the end of the first thought before the conjunction word. I've seen a lot of mistakes on this particular comma rule. Even on the test that you all took right before spring break, many mistakes on this particular comma rule. So if you look at the first example, it says velvet feels smooth and it looks rich and glossy. So first of all, I'm going to pick out my subjects and my verbs. I don't have to do this every time. But in order for me to be more familiar with being able to recognize where that comma goes, it's helpful for me to be able to pick out my subjects and verbs. So my first verb is feels. The subject that talks about who or what feels, velvet. Velvet feels smooth. So smooth goes with velvet to describe it. Therefore, I know that's part of it. In the second half of my sentence, I have another verb, looks. Who or what looks? It. It looks. It looks rich and glossy. Now that's not talking about Velvet is actually doing the touching nor the seeing, right? This is what we would call linking verbs. So smooth is an adjective that's going back to describe Velvet. Rich and glossy are both adjectives going back to describe it. So there's a little bonus for you. The comma is going to go after the word smooth before the word and. And you might say, well, that's pretty obvious. I know that. Okay, good. The second example says, my sister wrote a letter, but she forgot to mail it. So once again, I have two complete thoughts in this particular sentence. My sister wrote a letter. There's my first thought. So I could technically put a period there. Ooh, that looked more like a comma, didn't it? I struggle with this stylus. And then if I had to make it a separate sentence, I would leave out this word but and say she forgot to mail it, and that would be capitalized, right? So when I look at it that way, I could go back and pick out my subjects and verbs like I did on the first example, but I'm giving you another way to test whether you need a comma or not. And if I have two complete sentences, my sister wrote a letter, she forgot to mail it, then I can readily see that I'm going to use a comma there. So if I keep this word but, my conjunction, and I change that comma, that period to a comma, then I have a compound sentence. My sister wrote a letter, but she forgot to mail it. All right, so there's comma rule 3. Here's where it gets a little tricky. Previous slide, the difference is that I left out this word here. I have another couple of examples set up, and a lot of students, after they know to look for compound sentences and they are supposed to add their commas, they forget that sometimes there's a trick in there that's not a compound sentence at all, just a compound verb. So if I look at the first sentence, John looked for the lost donkey but could not find it. I have the verb looked. I know who or what looked is John. He didn't just look. He could not find it. Okay? Could not find the donkey. Not is not a verb. Don't forget that. Not is not a verb. In this sentence, I have two complete verbs. Looked, could find. The same person is doing both of those actions, the looking and the not finding. The not is not a verb, though. So in this case, I almost pause automatically after that word donkey when I'm reading the sentence. John looked for the lost donkey but could not find it. So it sounds like I'm going to need a comma there, but I don't, because there is not another subject going with could find. I still have the same subject, John. The second sentence, I wrote exactly like the first sentence. I wrote exactly like the sentence on the. My sister wrote a letter but forgot to mail it. In this case, I have the action wrote, the action forgot. Sister did both of those actions. Sister wrote, sister forgot. I don't have a separate she forgot to mail it. So in that case, I'm not going to use a comma. Neither of these sentences needs a comma. And this is where most students will miss that particular skill on the commas, because they're going to want to add a comma there, especially if the conjunction is but it can be with any of them. That's the most common, though, where my voice is going to naturally pause when I'm reading that sentence. But in this case, I don't need a comma.